مساء الخير. لا ما في مشكلة، بس هو جاي عصبي ما كل من ورقيه. مساء الخير، أهلا ومرحبا بكم إلى أمسية اليوم التي ستكون باللغة الإنجليزية. ربما سنتحدث قليلا باللغة العربية من أجل أصدقاء سمير طبلة في الفيسبوك. Today we have a distinguished guest who is Professor ستيفاني دالي. And I think most of us know who she is and what she has done and what her achievements are. ستيفاني دالي is a professor of archaeology. She worked at Oxford University. She has been associated with Iraq for the last 53 years, as I have been told by Christopher. Where's it, Christopher? Oh, at the back. Christopher was her husband. She went to Iraq as a young girl to work in Nimrud site, and also she went to Babylon, and she has learned so many languages, including the Babylonian and the Sumerian languages, in order to decipher the inscriptions left by the Babylonians and the Assyrians. ستيفاني's, it's difficult to really know everything about what ستيفاني has done, and her achievements are really beyond me. But she was able to find out about the influence of Mesopotamia across cultures. And this wasn't known. And she even found that some Mesopotamian deities were found in religious books. And that wasn't really known before her. And her major achievement is the discovery that the Hanging Gardens, which we thought were built by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, were not really in Babylon. They were in Mosul, in Nineveh, and they were built by Sennacherib. That was a groundbreaking discovery. Obviously, many people in Iraq didn't like it, but actually, at least, at long last, we know where the Hanging Gardens are, and they are still in Iraq. So we should be happy that there is a trace of the Hanging Gardens in the Palace of Sennacherib. And one of the things that ستيفاني discovered as well is that the water was raised according to the theory which was called later theory of Archimedes. And it turned out that the Assyrians knew this theory well before Archimedes, hundreds of years before Archimedes. ستيفاني دالي has raised the profile of Iraq, raised the profile of Mesopotamia through her discoveries and through her books. I'm not going to take long to talk about her, because it will take perhaps 2-3 hours to talk about ستيفاني. But I will let her speak about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and about her book, about the myths of Mesopotamia, and how she discovered that the Hanging Gardens were actually in Nineveh, not in Babylon. ستيفاني, the microphone is yours, and it's an honor to be with you, and thank you very much for coming to Salam House. Is it on?
I'm not expecting everybody to agree with me, but I welcome the comments that you'll make when you've heard what I have to say. It's quite difficult to explain every facet of this problem that I decided must have a solution. When I read that other scholars had said that the gardens perhaps never existed, that it was just a fairy tale, that was some of my English academic colleagues who thought that, and some also academic colleagues who thought perhaps the gardens were put upon a ziggurat. And I will explain to you as I go along why some of those arguments are wrong, but especially I will tell you that there is real evidence for what the gardens were like and where they were, and that's my main story. Other one. Okay. So I read Cuneiform script and language, and it takes a very long time to learn it. I also know ancient Greek, and those languages have been vital to know to work out what the solution to this problem was. So there we have a lovely clay tablet which shows the garden of, shows the plants which were put in the garden of a Babylonian king of the late 7th century, that is Merodach-Baladan II. Now, I'm just going to point out something from this. No, I'm getting it wrong. You can see that there are groups of text with underlinings there. And you can see that the sign here, we're reading from left to right, like English and not like Arabic. You can see that this is all the same sign coming down here, and that's the sign that means a plant. So you can all read a bit of cuneiform now. I will have a test at the end. The thing about this is it's a garden rather like a physic garden. It has groups of plants, so that in one section you have got all kinds of onions, and in another you've got all kinds of radishes, for example. And this is for a flat garden that was made probably in an oasis type of environment, where you've got palm trees in Babylon to shade from the sun, and you've got little canals that open and close to keep all of the plants that are edible from drying out. That's the Babylonian type of garden, and it's the kind that you have to have because the ground is flat around Babylon on all sides. And that's quite an important thing to know from what I'm going to tell you. This is an inscription of Nebuchadnezzar II, who is reported in only one of several Greek sources, reported to have been the man who was responsible for building the gardens in Babylon. And he is Josephus, who was writing in Greek in Jerusalem, and because of the experience that the Jews had had with the Babylonians, he put Nebuchadnezzar as the builder, and no other writer, not Diodorus Siculus, not Strabo, not Philo, none of those Greek authors say that, and some of them say it was not a Babylonian king, but an Assyrian king who built the garden, and he ruled in Babylon. So you can begin to see how the confusion might have arisen between Babylon and Nineveh. This is a complete inscription on stone of Nebuchadnezzar, and he mentions all the great things that he did, the temples and the streets, all the marvels that he built, and he doesn't mention a garden. Now this is odd. Dictators, great kings, are not notable for being modest. They mention their great deeds. So to find that he does not mention this great world wonder that is on the early lists made by the Greeks of world wonders is astonishing if he really built them, and gives one, together with the Greek understanding that it was an Assyrian king who ruled Babylon, that gives us pause in accepting that Nebuchadnezzar was in fact the builder of the gardens. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe it was an Assyrian king who ruled Babylon, as one of the Greek authors said. And in my book, which was written in 2013, I have explained all of these things in detail and given all the relevant texts in English translation in the appendix at the back. So you can check for yourself what the Greeks said. And there was no evidence at all from Babylon, even though we have a very large number of inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar. So the 7 wonders here, you can see that they're all remarkable things. The Great Pyramid of Egypt, or the several pyramids, are still known and still can be seen, but actually not a single one of the others is still to be seen. And the Hanging Garden of Babylon was the only one where we didn't know where it was and what it might have looked like. Now here are the features of the gardens according to Greek texts. And the first thing is that they're shaped like a Greek theatre. And to some extent what I'm going to tell you is more about the architecture of the garden than the plants, because we cannot get any evidence about the plants, which is rather sad, because we know that the Assyrian kings brought back plants from their travels, where they travelled very widely on military and trading expeditions. So it was also set beside the palace on raised ground, and we're going to have a look at Babylon to see that there is no place for it there. It had trees planted on artificial terraces, and that's what made people think perhaps a ziggurat was involved in the positioning of the garden. And of course Babylon had a great ziggurat, of which nothing is left. It had fallen down soon after the time of Alexander, and a lot of elephants were employed to shift the debris from it and to make another mound in Babylon. So there is only a square hole in the ground full of rather mucky water, I gather. I've seen photos of it, but they're perhaps not current. But the point about a ziggurat is it's a huge mass, rather shaped like a wedding cake with lots of tiers going up and up. And one of the Greek authors says that on the very top an astronomer sat with a chair and a table looking at the stars and doing his astronomical observations from there. And this seems very likely because it would have been quite dusty down below, and you could perhaps get a clearer sky if you were up high. But you build a ziggurat out of mud brick, and mud brick actually takes the stresses better than baked brick, I've heard. This is rather a surprise to me, but I have read it as an authority on bricks and how they can be used. And the outside of the ziggurat would have been faced in baked brick, just to protect it from erosion and rain and so on. So if you planted trees on the stages of a ziggurat, which is what people have claimed, you would have to water them. And everybody who's had anything to do with a garden knows you can't build a tree where its roots can't get down to the water table. You can't put a tree on a ziggurat without watering it. And if you do that, the water will soak down into the brick and the building will fall down quite quickly. Now that is simply a matter of fact, and I think does away with the argument that the garden consisted of shrubs and trees and perhaps flowers built on the stages of a ziggurat, a temple tower. And then we come to the fact that there's a pillared walkway at the top of the garden, roofed with many layers and planted with forest trees. That's what one of the Greek authors says. It's a very specific thing to say and a very extraordinary thing to say. And if we think of a Greek theatre as this has been described, you can think of those pillared walkways that they have around the top of a Greek theatre. If some of you have travelled perhaps in Turkey, where they have quite well preserved stone places, stone theatres, and you can still see the pillared walkway at the top. So that is an important fact, and I did find good evidence for that, which we shall come to. And then you have to raise water. If you're going to raise a garden on raised ground beside a palace, up at the top of a very high mound, you've got to water the garden, and this says that an aqueduct came in halfway up the garden to water the terraces. It was raised with screws. Now, of course, the inscription that I'm going to tell you about doesn't mention the name of Archimedes, because he's lived several centuries later. But many people who studied Greek engineering didn't think that Archimedes had actually invented the screw. They knew that his real speciality was the mathematics of raising water with a screw. And that was what he was particularly good at. And a friend of mine who looked at his contribution to the siege of Syracuse in Sicily said that it didn't work. It was a horrendous failure because he was such an impractical man. He could do the mathematics, but he couldn't do the actual physical thing of inventing and making a machine like an Archimedes screw. So, if we look at the map, we're going to see Babylon here, and we're going to go up and see that Nineveh is up here. So Babylon is on the Euphrates here, as most of you will know, and Nineveh, again as most of you will know, is on the Tigris. Now, these are very different environments. As we mentioned before, the land around Babylon, both on this side of the river and that side of the river, is flat. If we go up to Nineveh, we see there are mountains here, and that's where the rivers come down into Nineveh. So, this makes it clearer in that you can see all the tributaries coming down here from the mountains. They're all coming into the Tigris. There isn't a single tributary for the Euphrates here going up and up until we get to the Habur River that goes up into modern Syria. So they're very different environments, and as you saw, you needed an aqueduct to bring the water up at the right level for watering this garden, according to the Greek sources. And an aqueduct brings water down from above. You can only use it in a country or in an environment where you've got higher ground to one side or other. So this is meant to be a joke. Some people thought that the hanging word in hanging garden meant that it hung down from higher places, so you got trailing plants. And this is a misunderstanding and possibly even a mistranslation of the word. And it's clear from other Greek texts what it means. The garden is built up on terraces, and so it hangs above the ground level. That's what it means by hanging, and it has nothing to do with trailing plants or hanging baskets. Now, the great German excavator, Robert Koldewey, excavated at Babylon for a long time, very well supported by the German establishment in Berlin, because Kaiser Wilhelm II got very excited about it. They were building the Berlin-Baghdad railway at the time, and concessions were given. The concession was given to Germany, and Germany was then allowed to take materials for building the railway line from each side of the proposed route of the railway. And that route contained many of the greatest sites, the archaeological sites in Iraq and in Syria. So Koldewey was allowed to excavate at Babylon because the idea was that the railway would go down again from Baghdad to Basra. So that's why he got the concession, and he was a brilliant man. He had studied not just art history but architecture in a very thorough German style. He began excavating at the very end of the 19th century in 1899, and he dug all through every year until 1917. That's nearly 18 years, and you know how the climate can be, some of you, around there. It was extraordinary to keep going all that time. He was a remarkable man. The only thing was, he found, as you see from the plan here, the main buildings on the main mound of Babylon, and he couldn't find the Hanging Gardens. Now, he did look, and every visitor who came must have said, "Have you found the Hanging Gardens yet?" That must have been quite annoying. And he found the great palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Here we are with the great palace of Nebuchadnezzar here. And here we have the Euphrates River here. And this is all high up on the mound, a big mound, and the river runs down there quite low below. So how did you get the water past all these enormous walls? There's quite a lot of canals running along there, but there are no emplacements for bringing water up from the river. As you'll be aware, the river would be much fuller in the springtime when the snow was melting in the source of the rivers. And by the early spring, there would be very little water there. The level would be lower. So if you wanted, for example, to put up a bank of shadoofs, which some people have suggested, and you probably know the shadoof, it's a bucket on a levered pole, and you tilt it up and bring it up. And I'll show you a sketch of one in a minute. If you'd done that, you would have had terrible difficulty because of the different levels of the river. So that didn't really work. And what Koldewey thought was that this vaulted building here, which was built in baked brick and did have an installation in here for raising water from a well, and it seems, he called it a Paternoster, and it's a sort of bucket chain on probably on ropes. I don't know how it would have been turned, because you couldn't have had a water wheel anywhere there. And Cordovay didn't work out how it did work. And I think that probably what this building was about was that it had a nice roof garden on it, which would have had plants on it. And the position of it is exactly right, with the Ishtar gate here, and the processional way coming along here. This is the processional way. All the great festivals, all the great processions came along that route. And you could have seen, if you had been on a roof garden here, looking over the wall, you would have been able to see the processions, and more important, you could be seen by the people coming along that road. And this is comparable, and perhaps an imitation of the Egyptian phenomenon, where you have an audience chamber, and it's high up on a building, and it's a bit like the balcony at Buckingham Palace. You know, you need to show the ruler at these processions, or maybe he's in the procession and you need to show his family up there. So that's my suggestion for that building, to explain what has been pointed to every visitor. The remains of that have been pointed out as the Hanging Garden of Babylon, perhaps. But actually, I don't think Cordovay believed that it was the Hanging Garden. He just got so desperate with people coming and asking him where it was. And if you read carefully what he said it was the Garden of Semiramis. And he put the Greek sources out, and he knew perfectly well there's nothing like a Greek theatre there. There's no way you could have brought in an aqueduct. None of the criteria that we found in those Greek texts matches what he found there. And it is a very interesting building, and it deserves to be highlighted to visitors coming to Babylon, but it is not, I think, the site of the Hanging Garden. So we're coming now to the Assyrian king who ruled Babylon, that is Sennacherib, somewhere around 700 BC. He built himself a very fine new palace, and on his inscription, which is on this cylinder, or whatever you call it, prism, that's in the British Museum, and there's a duplicate, I still hope, in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. He wrote an account of building the palace and how beautiful it was, how it was a wonder of the world, and how that he raised the ground beside the palace very high up on the mound. Some of you who've been to Mosul will know how high up that mound is with the palaces on it. So it is a palace garden, and all of the accounts say that, but it's beside the palace, not inside it. So now, one of the things that first attracted me to the problem was this translation, which was made by an excellent scholar, Daniel Luckenbill, in 1924. Now, it was extremely difficult to understand a lot of inscriptions still at that point. We didn't have our famous Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, which is now finished, and we didn't have the great, enormous 3-volume work in German, the Akkadisches Handwörterbuch. We had neither of those as aids to scholars in 1924. So what you'll see there is how he understood it. And he says, and this made no sense at all. The workmen, through ignorance and lack of knowledge, they drank oil and wore sheepskins to carry out the work they wanted to do in the midst of their mountains. Now, this didn't make sense at all. What were they trying to do? There must be some mistake there. Well, I found, using the new dictionaries, with the huge advantages that that gave to me, that the word ishkuru also happens to be identical to the word for wax. Well, that's a bit different. So once I realized that, I started looking at the kind of technology that he was trying to describe. And with the, let's go to this word, the great posts here, gishmachu, and I was giving a lecture about this when I hadn't got very far with the problem, and I was talking in Heidelberg to a group of Assyriologists, and one of them came dashing up to me, and she said, well, this word for the tree trunk is the word that's used in mathematical texts for a cylinder. Because obviously when you want to describe something artificial, you tend to take a word for something similar that occurs in the natural world. And I often think that in generations to come, people will wonder what a mouse was doing on your desk while you were working. Some people have never even seen one. So gradually I tried to see how we were understanding this. And where are we have this word alamitu, which had been worked on by scholars and was understood in the dictionaries to be a type of date palm. And when I asked a man at Kew Gardens in London, who was a world expert on palm trees, in particular the date palm, he explained to me that the date palm has two genders, it's male or it's female. Many of you will know this. And that the alamitu is the word that it has, it doesn't bear dates that you can eat. And you have to pollinate using the flowers, the spathes from the male palm to fertilize the female. So the alamitu was a palm tree, and because I had been excavating with David Oates at Tel al-Rimah in the north of the country, and we had found a temple which had palm tree trunks around it, and some of them had the pattern of scallops, which you see when you cut the branches off as it goes up the tree, as the tree grows up. And some of them had a spiral. Ah, a spiral, I thought. Well, if they wanted to show architecturally a difference between a male and a female palm, they would have to have some device like that to show. And I think that there's no doubt in my mind, and I hope I'm right. Oh yes, well I'll go back to that in a minute. There's no doubt in my mind that they used the scallop for the female and the spiral for the male to differentiate, because you can't easily see it in mud brick on a temple facade. But anyway, what we had here is the remains of this inscription, where I have given you the words that were wrong in the time of Luckenbill in 1924. So we've got the wax there, and instead of the sheepskins, we've got tallow. Now, for those of you who've seen, well, they're trying to breed sheep now so they don't have any fat on them, which is rather a shame. But if you do see a sheep that's just been skinned, you'll see that it's got white stuff around it. And you can use that for casting instead of beeswax. So that was the explanation for those sheepskins. It does look very like white wool when it's on the sheep. So we've looked at the cylinders for the tree trunks, and now we've looked at the alamitu for the screws. And then he says, what Luckenbill correctly understood, I think, instead of a shadoof, I set up the cylinders and screws over cisterns. So a shadoof, of course, is the normal way of raising water, and I made a program to test out how easy it was to raise water for a great height. The shadoof is used a lot in Egypt at quite a low level, just to get water from a canal over a little bank into another little channel that will lead it to the crops. But this one has got to raise it much higher than that. It's got to be at an angle. The best angle is about 37 degrees. And so it's clear that Sennacherib has done something amazing in bronze. He has cast it by a new method. The old method used far too much wax, and he's got a method where you can do it with tallow, which is much more common. And he's very proud of what he's done. So there's a drawing to show the shadoof. And in the program that I made and helped make in Jordan, we tried it out. It's terribly exhausting. And one of the things you don't want in a really fine garden is a lot of sweating, groaning labourers having a dreadful time. What you want is something really remarkable that doesn't have such a lot of difficulty in it. And when Sennacherib mentioned this new machine he'd made for raising water, it was described by one of the Greek authors as a bit of a miracle, because you could raise water without anyone outside seeing it being done. You don't see it. It's going inside the screw. And, oh yes, there's a temple facade with those spiral columns at Tel El-Ramah. And they've been found on very many other sites in Iraq now. There's some at Lhasa, some at Ur, which many of you will know, and a lot of other sites. There. Yes, and then at Tel El-Ramah we found these two slightly crummy pictures, but here we've got a god. Oh, no, sorry, pressed the wrong bit. Here we've got a god. He's got a beard, and he's got these spiral trunks going up to, alas, missing tops. And here we've got a goddess in the typical pose of a goddess with her hands in front of her, and you can see quite clearly the pattern of scallops that goes up the trunk, and you can see the beginning of the palm fronds starting to come up at the top. So I hope that's fairly clear. Now, just quite a short time ago, I had an email from a lady who lives in Canada now, and she showed me this picture of a screw, and she said that our fathers used to call this Horma Agacha, which means a palm tree. Well, I thought that's very interesting. If the idea of the screw representing a palm trunk has come across in Old Turkish, I thought that's very interesting. So I'm letting you in on this new development, which I did find remarkable. And I have no particular reason to doubt it, though I perhaps need somebody to go and check it out for me in Turkey. But if any of you are going, perhaps you'd do it for me. Now, the screw then, I'm showing you how it works. We've got the cisterns, so you've got to have a consistent level of water, and the bottom of the screw has got to go down into the water here, and you simply turn the screw, and the water comes out with remarkable ease into the next cistern, and then with remarkable ease into the next cistern. So that's the way that you would raise the water with the Archimedes screw. The only thing that I have absolutely failed to find any evidence for is how the screws were rotated. You've got to turn them. And we tried on the first program I made with fixing, let me see what I'm pointing at. No, We tried fixing sort of pleats on the outside of the cylinder and treading them. But if you've got something going at 37 degrees, it's practically impossible to stay upright, and it's really very difficult to do. So I don't think that's right. The inscription says that he used chains and ropes, and I don't know how that was done unless they had made something with cogs on it. Now, machines with cogs would be ideal for doing it with chains, and you would simply have to tug the chain like that, and the thing would revolve and the water would come up and spout out at the next level. One of the Greek authors says that the screws were set alongside the steps that went from the aqueduct to the top of the garden. You want to take it? So you can imagine the kind, I think 37 degrees, I'm not an architect, but I think that's not bad for the angle of a stairway. Right. So where might this garden have been at Nineveh? And that's, again, a question that I will not claim to have a solution to. We're not quite sure how far Sennacherib's palace went. Henry Layard dug this part of it here. We've got the river Tigris coming along here, and we've got the river Chosa flowing into it there. The Chosa there, and the Tigris there, and here's the palace of Sennacherib, and that part has been dug. And my colleague John Russell in America, who's done amazingly detailed work, thinks the extent of the whole building would have been along here. So you would have had plenty of room for pleasant views over the river and admiring the sunset, which would be delightful. And the only thing that I have found is that the contour of this area here is shaped more or less like a Greek theatre, and it has the right dimensions for the ones given by Diodorus Siculus. Well, I think that's as good as we'll get, but Nineveh was occupied even after the fall of Assyria for the next 1,000 years, and there's so much rubble, erosion, people digging up bits, all sorts of things have happened to it, and I don't think that there's any work to be done there unless we have an accidental find of an inscription that says this is the Hanging Garden, and that would be wonderful. But I think I have relegated that to my dreams now. I don't think I can claim, and other people think that the site of the gardens might be somewhere else. But it fits very well with the evidence, and that's what we have to stick with and realize that not everything can be solved right away. So there's the Jordan documentary, a still from it, and we made these Archimedes screws out of wood in a workshop with a very good carpenter. And this is what we fixed on the outside to see if we could tread it round, doing it by tread. Because there is actually a book in the Old Testament in Hebrew, in the book of Deuteronomy, and I've quoted it in my book, which says that people turned the screws to water their gardens with their feet. And that's what you would do with this. But you wouldn't try and do it at this angle. And this is the angle we need for Sennacherib's garden. So certainly Sennacherib doesn't say we use people to turn it in the same way that the Hebrew text does. So it was a fearful business to try and turn those screws. Really, we didn't find out, but when we did turn them, they were very, very efficient. And we know from the way that doors were done in the Assyrian palaces that they had excellent fittings for turning things, and they had an allocation of oil for the bearings. You have to have bearings for a door that swings on a post, on a pillar, and that, I think, is how we have to imagine it, working rather better perhaps than our bearings here. Now, the great thing was that when I eventually came to look at these original drawings, which are in some enormous volumes, 4 of them in the British Museum, covered in elephant hide, which makes them rather especially magnificent. These are drawings that were made at the time when Layard, Sir Henry Austen Layard, was digging at Nineveh. And he made drawings, it's just before photography took off, so everybody had to draw what they found. And he had, my colleague Julian Reed, very brilliantly, found a receipt of Layard's for something called a camera lucida, which you can set up so that you get the exact proportions of your drawing right before you begin. You probably know the camera obscura, which is very commonly used in the Renaissance and onwards for paintings. But that gives you a back-to-front image, a mirror image. The camera lucida, which is slightly harder to use, but invaluable if you have to draw on the scale that Layard did, this is what he used. And Julian Reed found a receipt for a camera lucida in the British Museum, which just shows you shouldn't always throw away all your old receipts. What we have here at the very top of the garden is exactly what the Greek authors described. The layers and layers and layers that were put up, and then topsoil on top of them, and then forest trees growing on top, with the garden in the shape of a Greek theatre down below. And because you've got water coming in, as I'll show you, halfway up, and some of it's trickling down, you've obviously got to have something to collect the water at the bottom, and you make it into a feature which is really rather fun. And I think this is, you know, amazing hijinks, gymnastics, and training for the army, how to cross in secret when you're going to besiege a city that lies on a river. And we actually have campaign sculptures that show people with these inflated skins coming up to the wall of a city. So I think it's rather like a military tattoo, where the soldiers show off their skills at loading horses onto boats, at swimming on inflated skins, and then you've got the Hosa River right next to where these gardens probably are, so you can drain the water off and have fresh water coming in off the aqueduct all the time, so you don't end up with a rather smelly pond where mosquitoes breed. And I think I've got a picture of our bronze caster on that first Jordanian programme did me a drawing where he got a waterfall coming in from the very top, because that helps, of course, to keep the water fresh. So that would have been a very pleasant place for the king to walk out of his palace, high up, and to watch his best soldiers showing off their skills and so forth. So this is the famous sculpture that shows the Hanging Garden, and I'm just going to show you, because it's quite difficult to look at that. What we've got is the water coming in along here and then going down there, and then we've got layers of garden showing up here, but up here it's broken away, so we can't tell what happened at the top. But I'm going to show you a drawing of it. I got a very, very large print, a photographic print of the garden from the British Museum, I did a tracing of it for a drawing so I could bring out all the features more clearly than you can see really on screen. And you can see there, I think. These are the stone arches that make it a hanging garden. It hangs on top of the arches. So the trees that are planted up here can't get their roots down into the water table. They have to be irrigated. Here's the water coming in and coming down in various streams. So it is like a mountain garden with trees where you can have a picnic in the shade. And up here, just here, you see the very corner of a building. And I think that that's Sennacherib's building. How am I doing? Are we all right still? Time? Is that somebody knocking at the door?
You have 7 minutes.
7 minutes,
Yes.
thank you. I hope to finish in 7 minutes. Anyway, I think you can see there how it works. And then somewhere up here there must have been steps to take you into the top of the garden and the screws set up alongside the steps. But here it's absolutely clear that there's an aqueduct, and that joins into the great works that we found on our second programme documentary to show the water coming all the way, I think it's 90 kilometres from German and Chenis. That shows something of the waterworks that was possible. And my husband suggested putting in this ridiculous thing here. But I was very young when I first went to Iraq, and I was lucky enough to go to this place. And here, I mention it because Sennacherib is very interested in engineering. There's no doubt he's got a very good engineer with him, and they lead each other on. He's also interested in the condition of the workmen, as you may have noticed from the inscription that I gave. But here we have got the workings for oh dear, the words eluded me, for a lock, so that you can drop something down and block the water off. And Sennacherib says that he made one of these for blocking the water off. What is the word?
Sluice.
Sluice, thank you. A sluice. He made a sluice, and it worked without the use of men's hands. So he's obviously got a mechanism to move the sluice, and that shows he's not just interested in the screws for the garden, he is really interested in making machinery and not exhausting people, which is really very interesting as a comment on his attitude to the workforce. So now, coming to the end of this, this is the traces so far found, to my knowledge, from the source here. There's a gorge here at Chenis on one side, Bavian on the other, and here come these streams tapping into streams that are already there, coming across at the Jerwan aqueduct there, coming across here, and then joining the Khosa River, coming to the Shalalat Dam, and then how does it get into Nineveh, or does it come here, or both? We don't know. And that's the only thing that we might be able to find is more footings for how you brought the water across aqueducts. But the stone is so easy from an aqueduct to rob for buildings that it would be surprising if people hadn't taken Assyrian stonework for their buildings in Mosul a long time ago. So that's some of the work that they did. Apparently this part of it is thought to be later, but the only place where we've got inscriptions is at Jerwan and at Bavian, and they are all inscriptions of Sennacherib with a lot of detail about his waterworks and how he did this. Now, to bring water in over 90 kilometers from a high point into a garden at the right height by gravity is absolutely remarkable. And they must have had people who could do that kind of engineering work with extreme precision. And there's no doubt about it. My colleagues Jason Orr from Harvard and Daniele Bonacossi from Bologna are both working on this. And Daniele has found the most amazing places where there were offcuts from the canal where they could irrigate fields, because I think it's very barren now, but there were lots of orchards. They were growing. They had kept a lot of horses. They had to have a feeding of the horses on good grass and so on. So he's found little landing stages where you could take the boats and load up the produce and then get it to Nineveh. So it wasn't that all the water was aimed at the garden. It was aimed as a big resource for Nineveh, I think. And that's what they're still working on. So Alexander the Great camped somewhere around Jerwan before the Battle of Gaugamela, where he defeated the Persian Darius III. Now, we have found from texts in the British Museum that have been put together from appalling fragments, and they've been recognised, and we've discovered that he was actually there for much longer than we thought, waiting for the battle, because there was lots of water there. He'd found an old storehouse actually at Khorsabad, I think. We found that there was a huge place with agricultural tools and other things, and I think he raided that because he had a huge number of men in his army, and he managed to cross the Tigris without being expected, which is very odd that he wasn't spotted, but he got his men over, and there they were camping with as much water as they needed, plenty for the horses, and plenty of time to look around all these wonderful inscriptions of Sennacherib. And perhaps he visited Nineveh too, he may have. So there we are at Bavian, and there's the end of the gorge where the river comes down, and off from the side of it we have the great stone that divided the stream between the natural flow of the water and the canal where they could regulate the height to take it down to Nineveh. And you can just see the crown of Sennacherib there. I would have loved to take a scrubbing brush to it when I was there. It's a bit covered in moss and lichen and so on. But we know that there were wonderful sculptures all around, and that's one of the ones on a rock. There has been a rumour that it was destroyed by ISIL, but apparently it's not true. Here is one of the gods. Yeah, that's Sennacherib, and here's a god standing on an animal, as they do. And there is the hand of Ishtar, the great goddess of Nineveh, here, and she's holding the ring that she presents to the king to show that he has the divine right to rule. It's a very fine piece of sculpture. So Sennacherib's all over this, and we have no doubt that he's responsible for the waterworks. There's a picture of the aqueduct at Bavian, where the water, which is seasonal, comes past, and it has to come through, while the main canal water comes over the top of that. So you can see, you can see the water comes through here when there's a flood, but the water comes across the top of this as a part of the canal workings. And there it is in the reconstruction by Torkild Jakobsen, who did a lot of work on it. So you can see how the stream, the seasonal stream, comes through the arches there, while the canal crosses the valley on this raised bed. And there, finally, is the reconstruction drawing done by my colleague Terry Ball, who, alas, is no longer with us, but he was the chief illustrator for English Heritage, and you may have seen some of his paintings of what places around Westminster looked like in the time of James II or whoever. He was a brilliant man because he would never do anything that didn't have a basis in fact with it. So he was ideal for me to work with, and he would send drafts and I'd say, well, how about this, how about that, and we would discuss the detail of it. And I think that this is ideal. We've got the palace, which goes all the way back there. There's the Tigris going along there, the Chusa coming along here, the wall of Nineveh along there, the palace at the end of it, according to John Russell's estimate. And there we've got the stairs leading up from the aqueduct with the screws on each side, the trees growing on top of this pillared walkway, and the aqueduct coming in and across there, and then being taken up to the pillared walkway. And I like to think that the king and queen could step out of the upper story of their palace, away from the mob below, if there was a mob, and just enjoy the sunset beside the palace. I hope I've convinced you with some of this fact, at least. But thank you for listening.
Many thanks, Stephanie, for this very interesting, very detailed information about Iraq, about archaeology, about Assyria and Babylon. They want me to talk in Arabic for a while to just to our audience. But before that, actually, earlier in your lecture, you mentioned that because the Nineveh is at the top, is in a higher position than Babylon, and the water came from a higher ground into the palace. But later on there is this water mechanism whereby the water is raised to the palace through the Archimedes screw. Which one is correct? Which one matters most? How did the water get to the Hanging Gardens? Was it because there is a high stream coming down, or is it through the Archimedes screw, through the aqueduct?
Well, we don't have a complete idea of how Nineveh was supplied with water. And as you know, in a bad year, in the hottest season, it's difficult to make sure that everybody has the water they need. And I'm sure there were other schemes at Nineveh, not just this one, and we have just found a part of it. And that part was used, among other things, for bringing in the water for the garden. But you have to think of this canal. I didn't mention too much about its dimensions, but actually it is enormous, and it was the size of the old Panama Canal. I think they're building another one now because it's not wide enough. it was hugely wide and hugely deep. So where we've got these landing stages beside the canal, you can imagine the fruit trees and the bundles of straw for the horses and so on being brought on boats along the canal to Nineveh, which gave it the transport that is so difficult to do in mountains, really. You can make roads, but they're always having a problem with, you know, landslides and holes in the road and wheels breaking. So the canal was a fantastic resource for the whole city and must have helped, I think, with its economy.
Okay, thank you very much, ستيفاني. راح أتكلم بالعربي حتى يعني موجز لهذه المحاضرة القيمة حول الآثار العراقية وحول الجنان المعلقة. البروفيسور ستيفاني دالي عملت في العراق منذ عام 62 وعبر هذه المسيرة منذ عام 62 حتى الآن تمكنت من معرفة الكثير من أسرار الآثار العراقية وتعلمت اللغات البابلية والآشورية بالإضافة إلى اللاتيني واليوناني، وتمكنت من قراءة الكثير من الألغاز التي لم تكن معروفة سابقا، ومنها ما كتب في عهد سنحاريب الذي وصف في إحدى اللوحات أن هذا القصر هو إحدى العجائب. فتمكنت السيدة دالي، البروفيسور دالي، من معرفة كل هذه الأسرار عبر معرفتها باللغات وقراءتها للألواح التي تركها البابليون والآشوريون. المسألة مسألة علمية بحتة، وهو رأي علمي يعتمد على أدلة. هي أبرزت الأدلة، وكل هذه السنين 2700 سنة لا نعرف أي أثر للجنان المعلقة في بابل حسب نظرية السيدة دالي، وإنما وجد الأثر في الموصل. ولا ننسى أن بابل هي الأخرى، أن ابن سنحاريب أصبح ملكا على بابل. فحسب نظرية السيدة دالي أن الجنان المعلقة لم تكن في بابل في الحقيقة، وكل الآثار على الأرض وكل ما كتب باليونانية وبالآشورية ويشير إلى أنها موجودة في الموصل وفي قصر سنحاريب. وهذه الأنابيب التي تنقل المياه موجودة في القصر حتى الآن. ومن شاهد منكم الفيلم الذي ظهرت به البروفيسور دالي يعرف أنه الآثار، يعني أظهروا كل هذه القنوات أن الأثر يشير إلى أن الجنان المعلقة هي في الحقيقة في الموصل وليست في بابل. ونحن كعراقيين ما زالت الجنان المعلقة في العراق، فيجب أن لا نحزن لأنها انتقلت من بابل إلى نينوى. هذا باختصار نظرية السيدة دالي، بالإضافة إلى هي لديها كتب كثيرة، ولكن فيما يخص الجنان المعلقة، وهذا هو الأثر المهم والنظرية المهمة التي جاءت بها، وهي باحثة علمية قادها الدليل إلى أن الجنان المعلقة هي في الموصل وليست في بابل. نعم، ربما يعني هذا الموضوع يحزن البعض خصوصا من أهل بابل، ولكن أعتقد أننا كعراقيين الآن لدينا دليل على الأقل أن الجنان المعلقة ما تزال في العراق. فشكرا للسيدة دالي، البروفيسور دالي، على مجيئها إلى هذا المكان وتلبيتها هذه الدعوة. وفي الحقيقة قبل أن نفتح المجال للأسئلة، أنا تحدثت مع الصديقة العزيزة الراحلة الكبيرة لمياء الجيلاني، وهي تتفق مع ما قالته البروفيسور دالي. the late Lamia Al-Gilani, she told me that, you know, your theory is correct, and she tends to agree with you. Now we open the floor for questions, and we'll start with a lady here, and of course, the ladies come first. You can.
شكرا لراعي هذا
Do
المجلس.
you want to speak in English? Can you speak in English or in Arabic?
لا.
In Arabic, that would make my job harder. That's fine.
وشكرا لحضرتك وشكرا للبروفيسور على هذه المحاضرة المهمة. هناك قصور بنت يجوز تشبه آثار بابل، بس مو هي بابل النخلة اللي هناك، لأنه أكو بالصورة شفت على شكل نخلة. النخلة ما تعيش بالموصل على الجبال، نخلة بالمناطق السهلة، فهذا أعتقد دليل أنه بابل هي نفس منطقة بابل الجناي المعلقة. هذا رأيي أنا. شكرا.
Right. Well, I will tell Professor Dali so that she will answer later. She says there was a palm tree in one of your pictures, and the palm tree doesn't exist in Nineveh. So this is a proof, in her opinion, that the Hanging Gardens were actually in Babylon, because that's the land of the palm trees. So you can note that. A lady here. Let's give ladies a chance. Of course, Nadim Abdullah, you will speak. Oh, no problem. Huh? Yeah, of course. But this is, you can't read it all because it's too long.
Right.
Yeah, you.
Actually, I have just two simple questions.
That's
First of
good.
all is,
Sorry?
I have two questions.
Yes, okay.
First of all is, both Herodotus and Diodore mentioned that Nebuchadnezzar has built the Jannah al-Mu'allaqa for his wife. She was Kurdish from a tribe called Media, because she came from the north of Iraq and she missed the nature of these type of gardens. So in that case, we have to abolish this theory for Herodotus and Diodore, and we follow your theory. And second, if you can kindly tell us about your experience in excavation in Tel Rimah, which I think it was your subject in the PhD thesis. We will be grateful for that. Thank you.
Right. Well, your first question, Herodotus
Well,
never
Professor
mentioned
Dali, if you answer the first question about the palm tree.
about the palm tree. Yes, sorry. It is true that the palm tree doesn't produce dates that far north, but you can find palm trees that don't produce dates quite far north. And in fact, there is a site in western Turkey which was called Nineveh for a while, and it has a palm garden, but this is a palm tree that doesn't actually have dates on it. It's a different species of palm tree, but I think they're all male and female. So what we have, I think, with the facades of the temples is the enormous influence of Sumerian and Babylonian cultural traditions on Assyria. So they don't have to be indigenous, they don't have to be local to Assyria. They are taken up from the importance of the south of Babylonia.
Right. About the second question, Herodotus.
Right, yes, remind me.
Well, she says Herodotus and who else?
Oh, yes.
Diodore.
Theodore.
Right.
Both mentioned the Hanging Gardens
No,
were
they
in Babylon.
don't. They don't.
They don't.
No.
They didn't.
They didn't. Herodotus never mentions the Hanging Garden. He does describe Babylon, and that was one of the clues that put me onto the right track. Diodorus doesn't mention it was Nebuchadnezzar. The only Greek author who mentions Nebuchadnezzar is Josephus. And he has a particular audience that he wants to interest in his stories because he's writing in Jerusalem. And the great deportation of the Jews took place to Babylon, not to Assyria. He's got a lot of things wrong, Josephus, and this is a subject for scholarship, but he is the only one who mentions Nebuchadnezzar.
So kindly, if you have evidence for that, can we look for resources to say that Herodotus didn't say that and he took it from Joseph, you said?
Well, you need to read my book.
I will.
Yes, I think you'll find the answers. All the texts, I mean, other people, other scholars have collected all the evidence in Greek. So I'm not the first to do that. But I think I may be the first to point out that Herodotus never mentioned them.
Thank you. Senator, you wanted to ask a question.
Is it right that the idea of Babylon, of hunting, guarding, exists in Babylon, came from the old Bible? Because there is a story in the old Bible speak about that, about the people who built this hunting garden, and the God was very angry, and they couldn't complete it. So after that, it was destroyed.
Right. Okay. I think what you are thinking of is the Tower of Babylon. The Bible does not mention the garden,
Oh, the tower, yeah.
only the tower. And because some people thought the garden was on the tower, they have confused the two things.
Yes.
So I think the Bible does not have evidence for it. I hope that answers your
What
question.
about the Book of Enoch? Was there any mention of...
Enoch, well, Enoch is a big problem, but I don't think he mentions the garden. People have always thought, I think, that heaven, paradise, has a garden in it, because everybody loves a garden.
Yeah.
But that's a rather subjective answer.
Right.
Well, thank you very much for a very informative lecture, a very enlightening lecture at the same time. My question is if the actual site of hanging gardens is really a mystery and is not known till now, and you show the evidence quite nicely in Nineveh, why didn't you call it hanging gardens of Nineveh, not Babylon?
Could this
Well-
work? What's famous about it?
No, why Babylon?
It's a name.
Why Babylon?
Well, there are several reasons. And one is that Nineveh became known as a Babylon, and we know this from an early medieval astronomical text. It recorded observations that were made in Old Babylon, and the astronomers can tell that those observations were made on a different latitude further north in the vicinity of Nineveh. But the use of these names, Babylon and Nineveh, are quite widespread. There's a Babylon in the Nile Delta, for example, in early Islam. There's a Nineveh at Aphrodisias in Caria in Turkey. There's a Cambridge in Massachusetts, in
Yeah, I know.
America.
There's Baghdad also in Georgia.
Oh, is there?
Yeah,
Oh, I didn't know
Baghdad
that.
in
That's
Georgia,
good.
Baghdad one.
That's a very good example then. So I think these names have a certain cachet and they're fluid. They can be attached elsewhere.
Is it hanging gardens or hanging garden?
It's one garden, actually.
The Greek uses both the singular and the plural.
Yeah.
And I just decided I would use the singular because it's only one garden. And because when you buy a house and you're looking at real estate agents, they use gardens for very small gardens at the front and the back. If they say a garden, they mean a big one at the back.
Yeah.
So that was one way of deciding.
Thank you, Stephanie. Nadim Abdullah, you have got some ideas on behalf of Raouf Al-Ansari.
Many thanks, Professor Dali, for this presentation, and Hamid for your introduction. In fact, I've been asked by my friend Dr. Raouf Al-Ansari.
Dr. Raouf Al-Ansari is an architect.
Yes.
He's an architect, and he's aware of all the architectural and all the building ways in. He wrote some article answering your findings that in the year 2000, and I tried to summarize it in 5 points. I read it in Arabic and try to summarize it in English for you.
No, summarize it in English because there are many other people.
Just read it as I said.
The questions that Rauf has in his mind about.
بسرعة بدقيقة واحدة إن بناء الجناي المعلقة واحد مراحل التطور المعماري العمراني لبناء الزقورات ونقطة تحول كبيرة نحو عمارة حضارية متقدمة انتشرت في جنوب العراق. إن الزقورات هي مصطبات من الطابق الطيني المفقود الآجر المتدرجة وعادة ما تكون فوق المرتفعات. إن طريقة رفع المياه إلى أعلى البناء عرفت عند البابليين في جنوب العراق ووسطها قبل استخدامها من قبل الآخرين في شمال العراق. In short, he's mentioning that most of the ziggurat in southern Iraq, they built from mud and bricks, and they are more using this traditional ways, and there is need to use the water mechanism with them. While in north, like Nineveh, and there are a lot of hills and mountains, and there is no need in the first place to build something like a ziggurat. And for me, just to add that nobody is doubting that there is a great mechanism in Assyria and in Nineveh, and that great sort of irrigation. Nobody is questioning or doubting that there is a great palaces. Nobody is doubting that there would be a great kind of hanging gardens or gardens. So the idea, you found something in Assyria, does not mean there is nothing in Babylon, for example. So now let's agree about Babylon. As you mentioned, and as I read, and I have all the original books for Robert Caldwell, which is published in 1914, and for 15 years, I understood very well, with 300 daily workers, he excavated Babylonian, and all we found, till now it's mainly what he found at that year, the 15 years between 1899 till 1914. This does not represent all Babylon. It's still there 10% or less, as some Iraqis till now say. So let's not build a theory that we have not found it, that it's not existed. Maybe it will be found one day and we'll sort it. And just for environmental reasons, in this year, in April, the damage it has done by the water flood has just wiped out a lot of evidence. So imagine, we are talking about 3,000, how many evidence can be damaged. Just the last point I would like to say, in the end of 80s and early 90s, with what's so-called the previous regime, the New Babylon built by Saddam and all these palaces at that time, there was a competition. The Iraqi authority made a competition and to give a reward for the best way to raise water from the ground to upper without using modern technology. And took some 3-4 months that competition. And I remember the winner was a Russian competitor. So I hope that you go back to find this paperwork and you'll find all those who participate in that competition.
Thank you.
Find which way can be the best way of raising water from
Thank you, Nadim. Thank you, Nadim. Perhaps you would want to give an answer.
I'll just mention about the ziggurats, that there definitely were ziggurats in Assyria, in the north of the country. There was a ziggurat at Ashur, there was a ziggurat at Kaltukoti-Minota, there was, that's from the north, and then there was one at Nineveh, there was one at Khorsabad, these sites that I showed you near to Nineveh. So there is no doubt that there were ziggurats there. There's also no doubt that you could not water plants on the mud brick tower. Now mud brick, according to what I know, and I'm sure that Dr. Azawi will know better than I do, that a mud brick can bear weight much better than a baked brick. This is a fact that I don't understand mechanically, but apparently it is the case, and that's why the towers were always built with mud brick, with a baked brick skin on the outside. Some people have thought that the tower which still remains at Borsippa was of baked brick, but it wasn't. It was burnt deliberately, and you can tell that when you go into the detail. And I've climbed up it myself and seen how it is done. But none of the ziggurats that we know were made of entirely baked brick. they could not have had a garden planted on them. So that's, I think, the main point that I could make for now.
Okay, right, thank you very much. Sadok?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Stefani. I've asked you 3 questions before, and this is the 4th question. In your documentary, you said the gardens or the whole palace need about 400 tons of water per day. Do you remember this number?
Well, somebody else worked that out for me.
I'm asking the first of all
Yes.
about this number, and secondly, if we have this number as a fixed, we can easily make our conclusion to know the cylinder or the screw.
Yes.
And my question: Did you work as on this equation or in this number?
No, I didn't, because I'm no Archimedes. I'm not good at mathematics.
Yeah, but there is maybe someone can help
But
you.
there may be somebody who could. But the trouble is, you don't know how much of the water that came in was just for the garden. You don't know how much was taken off for the orchards on the way. You don't know what the diameter of the screws was,
Yeah, exactly.
which is a key point. And you don't know how high they had to raise it. There are so many unknowns, and I don't like to guess. Maybe if I was a mathematician, I would be interested in the theoretical problem. But I,
Sorry, but there is nothing in Assyrian tablets about this things about measurements or.
no, there isn't, and it's a pity there isn't. What we have is a lot of mathematical tablets from the Middle Bronze Age, from the 2nd millennium BC, but we've got no school tablets with these sorts of problems from the Assyrians or the Babylonians. And I don't know why that is. I think they used writing boards a lot, because it's actually, you can get, well, I don't know. But the fact is, we don't have mathematical problem tablets from that period. If we ever find any, I shall be the first to look.
Well, so far we have, Professor Dali, we have been focusing on the water. How did the water get there? And obviously this mechanism existed everywhere, in Iraq at least. But is there any other evidence that you have found to support your theory that the Hanging Garden is actually in Nineveh, not in Babylon? Apart from the water can be raised, because there are other methods that can raise the water to certain heights. But what about the inscriptions that you have found, which refer to the Hanging Garden and the aqueduct that you found in Sennacherib's palace?
Yes.
Is this evidence, enough evidence for you to believe for sure that the gardens really were in Nineveh and not in Babylon? Apart from the water, let us leave the water
Yes,
aside.
okay. For me, the important thing is that the details come from Greek texts, and they're very much later, aren't they, than the time of Nebuchadnezzar, even earlier Sennacherib. So that's all the evidence we have, and it is very specific. And with my arguments, I've managed to make a good match from evidence between all these different features. Cultivate could not find a single one, and although it is true that Babylon, only a small part of Babylon has been excavated, it's the main royal area that has been fully excavated, and there is no room for a garden there. Now, if it's built beside the palace, it's got to be there. But there's no way that Babylon could have had an aqueduct. You've got to throw out all the evidence from the Greek sources if you want to claim that it was in Babylon.
So there is evidence apart from the water mechanism. Obviously, we'd like to Majid Hamashi.
Good evening, Professor, and thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. My question actually just maybe slightly outside of your subject, but it's very relevant. We as Iraqis and many people all over the world actually they are excited now about the prospect of UNESCO designating Babylon as a World Heritage Site. I think we in Iraq, more than any time in our history, perhaps we need to learn more about Babylon and about the 10 or 15,000 sites all across the country. It's a question of identity really for us now. I think we are suffering enormously for lack of identity. So this for us is a huge development, and we would like to capitalize on it as much as possible. We are honored to have you as an authority on Iraq's heritage and antiquities. So I wonder, how did you feel about that UNESCO thing? And are you intending to work with them or cooperate with them, or will you have any role if you are offered this opportunity?
Thank you, Majid. Actually, I would like to add also that to the benefit of the others who perhaps haven't known about the work of Professor Dali. It's not just the Hanging Gardens. She wrote about the Babylonian cities, the myths of Mesopotamia, other works. She has many papers as well as books. The Esther Revenge, which talks about the Babylonian deities, which were found in religious books. They found their ways in religious books as prophets. So there is a lot of work that Professor Dali did, and she raised the profile of Iraq and Iraqi civilization, which is the first civilization on the planet. And we Iraqis should be proud, wherever Babylon might be. We should be proud of our heritage, our civilization. So I would want you to respond to his point about the UNESCO and...
Yes. Well, it's marvelous that UNESCO has given a blessing to Babylon, but it worries me that UNESCO has no money at all. It gives this mark of distinction to certain sites, but that does not mean that they will take part particularly in the development of it. And I don't know how you develop Babylon. My only idea has been that you could have some kind of a virtual reality thing that you see, and maybe based on a drone that is a magic carpet and it flies around and talks about the different places. But I'm afraid that currently people would say Nebuchadnezzar was there, Nebuchadnezzar was there. It's a much more interesting story than that, and I think it needs to be done by real specialists, and they are in Germany by and large. I mean, there's been, because of Koldewey and all his papers and so on being there, I think they're the people, and they have done some work on the virtual reality. But just to mention one thing, you know that all the reconstructions of buildings in Babylon, at the top of the roof, they have crenellations, these stepped towers along the roof, like a sort of lace fringe. As far as I can make out, there's no evidence for that at all. But I'm sure they're going to get into every virtual reality that goes out. So I would be very unpopular. I would be saying, well, you haven't got the Hanging Garden, and you ought to question the tops of the buildings. I don't know if they want me. I think they want somebody with a fresh look. But I do like the idea of a magic carpet, and you can home down on a particular area and talk about the history of it, but the history of it comes from texts. They're not visual.
Babylon has a lot more than the Hanging Gardens, by the way. So, and the recognition of the UNESCO is a very important development, and it should put Babylon on the, should raise its profile at least. We have very few minutes left, so you have asked your questions. The gentleman.
Thank you very much. I think one thing we should have really stood out, which what you have said, is the aqueduct and the so-called Archimedes screws, which are very important in fluid mechanics and civil engineering developments. This has to be recognized rather than keep on talking where the gardens are. One question about the gardens. Was there in the Persian texts, which were in Babylon, and Alexander the Great, it was in Babylon, was there any mention of hanging gardens there in those texts?
If you excuse me, Professor Dali, we'll ask. We'll
That is my question.
Yes, right.
Yes, thank you. A few years ago, I watched a program in BBC 2 or BBC 4. It tells the same story what you have done, which is, it really, with respect to all your work, your very hard work and all your effort, but to convince me as a audience, the program was jumping for figures which he didn't come. I don't know how he come to conclusion. For example, he said the is about 90 kilometers long, about 50 meter width, and about 10 meter deep. These are big numbers.
Yes.
Really big volume of water.
Yeah.
How he didn't explain the commentators of the program. So what am I wondering, is it based on your theory or other professionals in
Well,
the
we
British
have
Museum?
clips of the canal, and we can measure it, and it has been measured. And the widths are, we know the width, and we know the depth.
Okay.
So that is fact. That is not an estimate of any kind. There are parts of the canal that have been measured, and that is where those figures come from.
What about the depth of the
Yes, well, we got to the depth of them.
Yeah. But the other question is, with all
No other questions, because
is your work, is your conclusion based on material things? It's only script on
Read the book.
Cuneiform, or a certain part of religious story?
the best way, I think, is to read the book, because she
Yes,
has put everything there.
I think we need to read the book.
Yeah. I think
And
we
it's
all should
translated
read.
into Arabic.
We all should read
If there is a religious story in it or not?
Professor Dali's books, not just one book. There are many books that she has written about Iraq, and I think she has served Iraq more than many of us. And we are grateful to you, ستيفاني, for your interest in Iraq, for your work, for your books, for coming here to tell us about your ideas, your theory, and thank you very much for coming here. في النهاية الآثار العراقية ثروة لنا، وأينما يكون الأثر هو لنا، سواء كانت الجنائن المعلقة في بابل أو في الموصل أو في أي مكان آخر. هذه المرأة خدمت العراق، خدمت الآثار العراقية، وخدمت الحضارة العراقية، فشكرا لها. Thank you very much.